Reproductive system. It's really one of my favorites to teach, probably because I was raised in a state that did abstinence only sex education. And so I really didn't know a lot of this until I started studying it to actually teach it. And I learn more every single time. I learn a lot from my students, actually. One of the things that I learned was that quite often, even academics use the terms sex and gender interchangeably. And I learned from one of my students that it's incorrect to do that. So, of course, I changed my presentation and I did some reading. So, the first thing I'm going to start out with you guys doing is identifying some terminology and how we're going to use terminology. So before we get into the process of you becoming a sex at all, because there was a stage during embryonic development when you had no anatomic sex, I want to define some terminology. First of all fetuses start out with the anatomic possibility of becoming either an anatomic male or an anatomic female. And this begins 5, 6 weeks, 6, 7 weeks. It varies a little bit in what they say. The process of differentiation to becoming one or the other biological sex. But first, let's go ahead and define sex versus gender, realizing that I have absolutely zero expertise on gender, but I do want to try my best to be consistent about using the terms correctly. So what is sex? Sex is really biological traits, and there are at least 5 different determinants of biological sex. The first one is simply XX versus XY, your sex chromosomes. Although there are variations, there are more X's, there are more Y's, there are fewer X's, there are no Y's, you can have an X0, but let's just stick with typical chromosomal sexes, XX and XY. And of course, you know that in humans, XX is female and XY is male. It's not the same in all animals or even in all mammals. And then there are your sex hormones. That's the next biological determinant of sex. And that has to do with whether you have a preponderance of estrogen and progesterone, or a preponderance of testosterone, realizing that both sexes have some of both classes of hormones. It's just in a reproductive age female, you have higher concentrations of estrogen and progesterone, and a reproductive age typical male, you'd have higher concentrations of testosterone. And then the next determinant is what type of gonads a person has. Gonads are the same embryonic structure, but under different environments, they develop into ovaries or testes. Ovaries will, of course, stay up in the abdominopelvic cavity, and testes will fall outside of the abdominopelvic cavity and exist in the scrotum. So that's that. And then the internal reproductive glands and ducts. The duct work we'll talk about in just a minute, but basically there's some duct work internally, and that will either develop into the oviducts or fallopian tubes and the vagina and a couple other things, or into the vas deferens and the seminal vesicles and a couple other things. And then, of course, there's also the external genitalia. The external genitalia will develop into the clitoris or the penis, and we'll talk about those too. So the biological traits, we're going to run through especially these. This one is genetics. It's pretty interesting stuff, how that occurs. And this one is primarily physiology, but these are anatomical, so we will definitely go through those. But what's the difference between sex and gender? Gender is really your social identity, and it is independent of sex, which is not the topic of this course at all, but I will address it to emphasize correct terminology. You guys are going to be healthcare professionals, and so you are in all likelihood going to be dealing with people of both sexes, and multiple genders. So knowing how this terminology corresponds to a human is useful for all of us. Okay, so what I want to talk about is some internal and external reproductive structures first, and then we'll come back to this one. So so this is about at week 6. So let's do the internal structures first, and then we'll do the external structures. So in this figure, what I want you to know is that homologous structures are going to be the same color. So this is the sexually indifferent stage. This is before differentiation has started to occur. This is about 5-6 weeks post-implantation, meaning 7 maybe weeks after fertilization. So what I want you to see is that there's a couple things that they have in common, even at the end. The gonads stay gonads, stay gonads. The urinary bladder stays urinary bladder, for instance, not a big surprise. But there's 2 sets of ductwork internally. And at 5-6 weeks, you have both sets of internal ductwork. The pink ductwork that you're seeing here is called the paramesonephric duct, or the Mullerian duct, right here. And these are the structures that, if they continue development, will develop into the oviducts or uterine tubes or fallopian tubes and the uterus. Okay? So, and then there are the purple ducts that you see here and following through here. And if those continue development, they will develop into the epididymis, the vas deferens, and the seminal vesicles. Okay? So through a process I'll explain to you in just a second, one of these sets of ductwork will disintegrate and the other will complete development in a typical anatomical and female or male. Okay, and then internally and externally there are some homologous structures. So I don't know if you know the term homologous. It is used not uncommonly, but if you haven't taken an evolutionary biology class, you might not have run into it. Homologous in this context means it's derived from the same embryological structure, meaning it is the same structure that develops differently. Okay, so homologous structures. The gonads are the same male and female. They will develop either into ovaries or into testes, but they are derived from the same embryological structure. Okay, and then here, when we are looking at this picture that shows the development of the external genitalia, some things that you will need to know. If you watch this, this is again the sexually indifferent stage. There's no anatomical difference at about 6 weeks. And then if you watch, the same color will develop into the same structure in males and females. So what are homologous structures in the external reproductive organs? The glans clitoris is the same anatomical structure as the glans penis. The labia minora is homologous to the skin that forms the shaft of the penis. And the labia majora is homologous to the scrotum. Okay, and then there's some internal structures as well that you can't see here. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take a minute and talk about how this actually occurs, how the process of differentiation occurs. And I've got this like complicated figure for you. I'll link it for you at the bottom of your notes. But I'm not going to test on it in this kind of complexity. I just think it's something that's actually worth knowing. So no more complexity than is what actually is in your notes, and maybe even I'll go a little easy on that. Okay, so in humans, not in all animals, the default anatomical sex is female, meaning that if you don't do anything, if you don't flip any genetic switches, what will happen is you will end up with external genitalia that looks more female. It doesn't mean that you'll be a functional reproductive female. It means the default look of the anatomical sex is female. So I want to talk about what actually occurs to make that happen. Okay, so here's the deal. Default anatomical sex is female. The process of sex differentiation to make someone go down the path of becoming a male is because of the Y chromosome. Females don't have a Y chromosome. Males do have an X chromosome. So sex differentiation begins when a gene that's only present on the Y chromosome, it's called SRY, that gene, activates around 6 weeks gestation. And what that does is it initiates the gonadal differentiation into testes. So what we have here is the SRY gene, which tells these undifferentiated gonads to go ahead and start going down the testes path. Okay, so first thing, SRY gene says, I want you to become testes. Interesting thing is that before this occurs, the nipples have already developed, which partially explains to you why males have nipples when, of course, they don't lactate. Okay, so basically, nipples form before sex differentiation occurs. So if this does not happen, however, no X chromosome, then they are going to do what they were going to do anyway, and these gonads will start to develop into ovaries. Okay, so that's one way in which I mean the default anatomic sex in females is female in humans. Okay, then what happens is if I am going to develop down the path of becoming a male, what happens is now that they know these are testes, they are going to secrete a hormone called anti-Mullerian hormone. And anti-Mullerian hormone or Mullerian inhibiting hormone will cause disintegration of the Mullerian ducts. So let me show you that one more time. So what that will do is in a male, when these decide to be testes and not ovaries, they will activate this hormone called Mullerian inhibiting hormone or anti-Mullerian hormone, which will cause disintegration of these ducts that would become fallopian tubes, uterus. Okay? And I know this is a little complicated, but I want to go through it because I think it's interesting and important. Okay, so I just disintegrated the stuff that was going to become the internal reproductive tract of the female. And now what is going to happen is the testes are going to start secreting testosterone. And as they start secreting testosterone, the testosterone will say, oh, okay, these Wolffian ducts are going to start to develop into an epididymis, a vas deferens, and a seminal vesicles. Okay, so the Wolffian ducts will complete development into that. And then that also causes the outside to become, the testes will start to descend. They don't actually go all the way into the scrotum until about month 7. The labia will fuse to form the scrotum. The glans clitoris will form the glans penis. And so notice you had to flip a few switches in order to become a male. You had to have a functional SRY gene, first switch. Then you had to flip that anti-Mullerian hormone switch. Then you had to turn on testosterone. If you didn't do all of those things, you were going to go down this path, okay? So if there is no testosterone, then what is going to happen is the default over here, those Wolffian ducts will degenerate, and you're just going to continue down the path that you were going down to become the female external and internal genitalia. So what is anatomic sex? This shows to us, and there's a couple of experiments that also show to us that really what anatomic sex is, anatomic maleness, it occurs in the presence of testosterone, okay? But anatomic femaleness is not the presence of estrogen, it's the absence of testosterone. Some evidence that we've found, both anecdotally and experimentally, is if a pregnant woman is injected with testosterone, like if someone was abusing anabolic steroids, at the right point in development, the presence of testosterone in her bloodstream can actually cause the developing fetus to go down this path, even if it is an XX fetus. So if a pregnant woman injects herself with testosterone at exactly the wrong time during development, what can happen is this testosterone will make these things happen. Now, I'm not saying that she would produce a completely typical anatomical male, but she would have flipped a switch that said, you actually should start going down this male path instead of down this female path. And then there's also one other interesting piece of information, and that is there is a genetic condition in which the testosterone receptors do not work. And so if the testosterone receptors on the fetal cell membranes don't work, then an XY fetus will develop as an anatomic female because you can't tell testosterone is there. And that's called androgen insensitivity syndrome. Okay, the last thing here is what happens after birth. So you've got this if you're a male and you've got this if you're a female. After birth, the gonads are pretty much latent until puberty. So you really don't have from like birth until, I don't know, whenever you hit puberty, somewhere between 9 and 14 usually. No appreciable difference in the level of sex hormones in males and females. So at puberty, what happens is there's a hormone in the brain produced from the hypothalamus called GnRH. And what it will do is it will ultimately cause the gonads to begin production of sex hormones, and then ultimately like production of sperm and eggs. And then puberty will become noticeable. Okay. All right. So we'll stop there for that one.